Hi. When we talk about the war, I want you to remember that the South fired first. When the newly formed CSA fired on Union troops who had retreated to Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, they took up arms against the United States. The war was engaged when the Union refused to accept the secession of the South. By keeping the troops on Fort Sumter, Lincoln was fighting to preserve the Union, as his inauguration had sworn him to do. It's the president's job to preserve the Union, and this is what Lincoln intended to do. But the gunfire did what you'd expect. It galvanized both sides. The first soldiers were volunteers. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to fight to keep the South in the Union. And by July 1st, 1861, he had 300,000. By the same date, only 150,000 men had volunteered for Confederate service. Of course, the CSA was a smaller country, so it was a smaller army, and smaller number of men to volunteer for service accounts for that number. But it also introduces the problem of resources and how much more the North had of everything you need to wage a war. The traditional comparison now. The North had 10 times more workers than the South had, and about 8 times as many factories. The value of the Northern economy, in terms of the production of goods, was 10 times the size of the Southern. Remember, the South brought in income by selling cotton in Britain, but beyond this, they didn't make much. While the North had the factories, canals, and infrastructure, their contribution to the American economy was bigger in the production of goods. The North had 70% of the railroad trackage, remember, from the Transportation Revolution, and it made 17 times as much cloth as did the South. Armies need cloth for uniforms, tents, saddle blankets, sleeping bags, and the South made 17 times less of this than did the North. Guns matter even more, of course, and the North had 32 times as many as the South. Iron needed to make more railroad tracks and more guns was 20 times more plentiful in the North than in the South. It's just like you've always heard. The industrializing North had more resources, and the South grew raw materials for export to industrial nations. Like a colony, the sources of Southern wealth kept it from developing in all the categories needed to wage a war. However, keep in mind that while the South had less available, they also needed less. All they had to do was defend. They did not have to attack. They wanted independence, not parts of the North. And if they had hunkered down and defended their territory against invasion, they would have only needed a third the resources of the attacking army. It costs 3 times as much to attack than to defend, in other words, according to the military theorists of the age. The man who wrote the manuals for fighting that shaped the actions of the armies of the Civil War was a Frenchman named Antoine-Henri Jomini. Born in 1779, he wrote a treatise on Frederick the Great and how he had gotten the Prussian army to drill to shoot faster. Jomini was hired by Napoleon and responsible for much of his military success in 1805 to 1815, and Jomini published a book on the art of war in 1838. Jomini's Art of War was the basis of most Civil War strategy. In it, Jomini argued that a defending army needed less men and less gunpowder than an attacking army. If the CSA had just built up its borders and fought off any invaders, they might have worn out the U.S. Army and done a little better. This they did not do. General Robert E. Lee favored offensive war. He liked to attack. And it didn't help that he was in charge of the Army of Northern Virginia, which had the 2 capital cities of the 2 combatant nations, Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Virginia, less than 100 miles from one another. Remember, too, that Lee had been reluctant to secede. His army's experience was typical of the border states, reluctant to secede, but drawn early into skirmishes. So, in the face of revolt and secession, Lincoln called for volunteers, who filled the streets of D.C. and inflamed Northern opinion to go out and fight. On to Richmond was the battle cry. Lincoln sent 30,000 troops under General Irwin McDowell to attack General Beauregard, who had commanded the army in South Carolina that had opened fire on Fort Sumter, and his army was camped at Manassas, or Bull Run, just 25 miles west of D.C. This is one of the peculiarities of Civil War history. Most military engagements have two names. Generally, Northern armies referred to natural features, while the South named the battle after the nearby town. So, for the North, this first battle was called Bull Run, named after the creek between the two armies, while the South called it Manassas for the nearby railroad junction. The first battle here played out in the second half of July, 1861. The red are the Confederates, who are encamped along the creek named Bull Run, and the blue are the Union, who tried to attack over the bridge. At first, the Union is successful, but then Confederate reinforcements arrive, under the command of Joseph E. Johnston, and the two Confederate generals counterattack and rout the Union, and could have probably chased them all the way back north to D.C., but both sides were too disorganized at this point. The USA deployed 30,000 soldiers and lost 2,700, while the CSA had 1,900 casualties out of 32,000 soldiers. Basically, the South won and drove the North into retreat. Lincoln used this defeat to appoint General George B. McClellan, the commander of the Army of the Potomac, and gave him 185,000 soldiers to command, and he sat around doing nothing. Lincoln said that McClellan has got the slows, and tried to figure out what to do to get the South back into the Union. All this was in the Eastern theater of war, which gets most of the press, but the war was really won by the North and lost by the South in the Western theater, along the Mississippi. Because if you look at the map of the Confederacy, it's obvious that the rivers and creeks of the eastern states all run east-west, which makes offensive warfare difficult. To get the armies to battle meant crossing all of these rivers. It was hard to advance, so the Eastern theater of war sat in stalemate for a while. Meanwhile, in the West, the waterways run mostly north-south, which, along with this gigantic open coastline, 3,500 miles of coast to defend, and rivers emptying into it, paths into the interior, the rivers of the Western theater of war left the CSA vulnerable to the naval operations of the North. We'll see this effect play out as the war drags on. In the Western theater, the Union won the war with combined operations, combined naval and army operations based on controlling the rivers and heading into the Confederate interior. The Western theater of war also provides us with a bit of local history that sets the pattern for the rest of the war. In February of 1862, the Confederate General Henry H. Sibley led 2,500 Texas cavalry into New Mexico in a bid to grasp the Southwest. At first, he outflanked the Union Army of 2,800 men under Edward R.S. Canby, but then the New Mexico General Manuel Chavez found and cut the Confederate supply chain. The Texans retreated to El Paso, starving for a lack of supplies, and lost 1/3 of their men, while the Union troops lost about 350. This set the pattern of the war, the initial success of bold Confederate maneuvers, followed by a shortage of resources, Union reinforcements, or difficulties with supply chains, with the Confederacy losing more men than did the Union, resulting in eventual Union victory. At the same time, as the CSA attempted to control the southwestern flank of its nation, there were additional battles in the Mississippian interior of the Confederacy that endangered the Confederate dream of independence. On February 6, 1862, the Union General Ulysses S. Grant captured Fort Henry on the Tennessee River with the aid of a Navy flotilla. This was a combined operation, and marched on Fort Donelson, here on the Cumberland River. Both these forts are on the Tennessee-Kentucky border and important river junctions. Fort Donelson surrendered on February 16th. In these battles for Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, the USA lost 2,800 troops, and the Confederacy lost 17,000. The battles broke the CSA's western line, and its army retreated south to Corinth, which was a railroad junction. There, the Confederate General Albert Johnston managed to rally 40,000 men, while Grant disembarked across the state line in Tennessee and waited for Don Carlos Buell and his 30,000 men marching in from Nashville. The CSA General Johnston wanted to attack before Grant's reinforcements arrived, and he was managing to push the Union back, but then he died, and his command shifted to General Beauregard of South Carolina, and Beauregard believed the battle was won, so he retired at dusk. Buell and his 30,000 troops arrived overnight and attacked in the morning, and pushed the CSA back, again to Corinth and the railroad links there. Stalemate. But in the 2 days that had passed and the furious battles around Corinth, 14,000 American soldiers and 11,000 Confederates were killed, just to end at the same place where they'd started. Then came the more famous Battle of Shiloh. Killed a lot of people, demoralizing to both sides. But for the Confederacy, it was worse. After the surrender of New Orleans on April 26th, and of Memphis on June 6th, the CSA had lost control of both ends of the Mississippi, holding only the region between Vicksburg, Mississippi, and Port Hudson, Louisiana. This had happened by the summer of 1862, a year into the war. A brief attempt by the CSA to invade Kentucky was beaten back. They found few people there willing to join up or help out. Kentucky stuck with the Union. By this time, summer of 1862, the ardor and loyalty for the CSA was cooling. It was at this point that the Confederacy began to draft soldiers rather than rely on volunteers. Meanwhile, back in the East, there was a submarine battle in Hampton Roads, Virginia in 1862. Yes, there were submarines during the Civil War. That was early in the year. In the spring came the Peninsula Campaign, while the 7 Days Battles and Second Manassas in the summer set up a pattern of offensive losses that cost the Confederacy dearly. Then, in September of 1862, came the Battle of Sharpsburg, Maryland, known as Antietam in the north, which killed 6,000 men in a day. Just to put that in perspective, that's 4 times the number of men killed on D-Day, and twice the number of Americans killed in the Iraq War altogether. The loss at Sharpsburg ended General Lee's attempt to invade Maryland, and then in November, the CSA lost an important battle at Fredericksburg. The battles in the fall of 1862 and the horrifying casualties and Confederate losses gave Lincoln the guts to finally seize Southern property, to seize enemy property as contraband, to seize the slaves belonging to the rebel traders, and then to free them all by executive order. This was a move that began to turn the Northern public opinion to a cause of war. In addition to being a war to hold the Union together and put down the rebellion, it became a war to free the slaves. That defeating the traitors meant changing their society. We call it the Emancipation Proclamation, and it took effect on January 1st, 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation focused the two sides on the purpose of the war, at exactly the moment when it seemed so dire. Now the North had a sense of purpose, to fight slavery. At a time when pessimism and a longer war than anyone had expected made spirits so low that defeats were dangerous to morale. And the South was more alert than ever to the fact that it was fighting off abolition of slavery. And Southerners were aware that if they could just hang on, stave off defeat, and inflict casualties, they could achieve their independence. Maybe. Spring of 1863 saw General Lee's greatest victory, the Battle of Chancellorsville, from April 30th to May 5th in 1863. But really, this was just more bloody fighting with little result. Each side lost 11,000 men, but the CSA could afford the loss less. Still, in 1863, the most important action was in the West, where, at Vicksburg, the U.S. really turned the tide of the war. Vicksburg here, in the middle of the Mississippi, which is not only the midway point on the Mississippi River, still controlled by the CSA between Memphis and Port Hudson, but also a railroad junction. The ability to link river and rail transportation ended when Vicksburg surrendered on the 4th of July, 1863, a great win for the Union. This cut the CSA in half, or rather into quarters. And with the blockade, the cause of an independent slave-holding republic was really lost. At the same time as Vicksburg was under siege in a combined operation of the Union Army and Navy, Lee, in the Eastern Theater, attempted his most daring offensive yet. In an attempt to draw Union resources and attention away from the Mississippi, Lee invaded Pennsylvania to try to make the Union scramble to defend its homeland, just as the CSA was always being forced to do. He met the Union Army at a place called Gettysburg. At Gettysburg, in 3 days of fighting, the Union lost about 18,000 men, and the CSA lost 23,000. That's more than 40,000 soldiers killed in 3 days. That's a bigger number than the entire undergraduate population of Texas Tech. Dead in 3 days, their corpses rotting on the ground in Pennsylvania. No more could Lee marshal the resources to attack. The defensive tactics throughout 1864 made the Union bleed for every gain. But this was the end game. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address focused the North on the reasons for the war and formed an excellent basis for his mid-war campaign to keep the presidency. General McClellan, a Copperhead Democrat, actually raised a stiff challenge to the incumbent Republican nominee. Lincoln's address admitted the sacrifice of war and explained its necessity. Meanwhile, the CSA was cut in half. No more sea outlet and no more Mississippi River commerce, fewer resources than ever. Lee played a brilliant endgame, but an independence was impossible by now. Then came the battles of Chickamauga, just outside of Chattanooga, and what we call the Wilderness Campaign, 10 months of carnage in the western part of Virginia, then the fall of Petersburg and Spotsylvania, and Sherman's march to the sea. This infamous Union victory began in the battle over Atlanta, another critical railroad junction in Georgia, where Sherman's men defeated Hood's army in 3 battles, before successfully cutting the Confederate supply line in August. With Atlanta's surrender in September, Sherman burned Atlanta to the ground and began marching his army through Georgia. This victory was probably the reason Lincoln won his re-election, but it wasn't pretty. Sherman said that he would make Georgia howl, and he did, marching 60,000 men on 4 parallel roads, engaging in total war as he went, bending the railroad tracks he encountered into Sherman bow ties to make them inoperable, ending up in Savannah on December 22nd, which he captured and offered as a Christmas present to President Lincoln. He kept his army there over the winter, collecting troops, and then continued his army's march up into South Carolina, where his assault on the State House is still preserved, still marked on the walls of the outside, where the big bad federal government bombarded the building, which did not fall down, even though South Carolina fell to the Union Army. Meanwhile, the Union Army under General Grant was slowly extending the Union line in the north, pushing at the CSI, finally broke the Army line near Petersburg, Virginia, in the spring of 1865. The CSA evacuated its capital at Richmond, Virginia, on April 2nd, 1865, and set fire to its capital city as it retreated. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia on April 9th, which is generally considered the end of the war. But in such a wide-flung war, with so many theaters of operations, other surrenders were necessary. Johnston to Grant at Durham, North Carolina on April 26th. That's 12 days after the assassination of Lincoln on April 14th. Another army in Alabama gave up on May 4th, while the rebel CSA president, Jefferson Davis, was captured on May 10th, and the final surrender of the CSA came at New Orleans on May 26th. Guerrilla warfare still continued, though. Internal divisions in the South, made worse by the war, were played out in the years to come, in the period we call Reconstruction. When Lincoln was assassinated on April 14th, his body was transported across the nation, the northern states, by railroad, so people could mourn his passing. The outpouring of grief was tremendous. And of course, his vice president became president of the United States. This was Andrew Johnson, who had been chosen to balance the ticket, to gain the support of the Northern Democrats who might vote for their candidate McClellan, to make Lincoln seem more like his opponent, which means that when Lincoln died, a long-term Democrat and former slave owner was President of the United States, and this shaped the course of Reconstruction, which is the last lecture in this class. It was the bloodiest war in American history. Of the combined armies, 40% of the soldiers who fought were killed. Nearly 500,000 young men, about your age, and at least 1 million more were wounded, or died of disease rather than wounds. If you count up the lifetime earning capacity of these men, and add to it the actual money spent on the war, trust me, economic historians have performed these calculations, the war on a whole cost about $6.5 billion. That was a sum of money that could have bought every slave in the United States at full market value and provided each man with 40 acres and a mule. Was it worth it? Absolutely. The thought of American slavery persisting into the 20th century, into the era of automobiles and movies and air travel, it's appalling. What else would have ended it? Ask the South, which fought for its institution so valiantly. But of course, emancipation did not result in racial equality, and our next lecture will begin to talk about why.